Hello and welcome to this podcast from the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. My name is Suzanne Raine and this is part of our series on resistance, radicalisation and religion, where we look at division and extremism in different parts of the world and at different times. Today our focus is on current violent conflicts in Africa, specifically those that involve Islamist extremist networks. And I'm joined by Dr Nayanka Perdigao, who is the Programme Associate at the Global Internet Forum for Counter-Terrorism, GIFCT. Nayanka was formerly head of the ALC Peace and Security Fellowship Programme at the African Leadership Centre, King's College London, and her background is on leadership, state-building processes, violent conflict and peace building in Africa. So who better to talk us through what's going on? Welcome, Nayanka, and we're very grateful that you could join us.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for having me.
So let's start. I mean, it's an enormous subject, but there are significant problems at the moment with instability, particularly driven by Islamist insurgencies of different kinds in different parts of Africa. And can we start with Mozambique, which is a country that we haven't talked about a lot historically in this context, but we really are now. And this seems to have been getting worse over the last couple of years. And in 2021, we've had a series of really kind of headline-making violent attacks, including beheading children, besieging and plundering the town of Palma. So what's going on in Mozambique and what's made it happen now?
Mozambique, I would say, is now suffering what I would call its third war over the last 6 decades. So all three have been the result of really complex interactions of national, regional, and global factors. For instance, the first one, the armed struggle for independence, lasted 10 years, from 1964 to 1974, and then the post-independence war from 1976 to the peace agreements of 92. And these were kind of regional wars, but also they were fueled by local and geopolitics, such as Rhodesia and South Africa were involved. There was also an internal conflict. Whilst what we're seeing today, and what many call an insurgency in the north and east province of Cabo Delgado, is driven by both internal discontent and a mixture of external factors. There is consensus that it began in October 2017, but it has escalated sharply since March 2020 and obviously has drawn increased international news coverage and debate. So if we go to the core of the conflict, to understand it, one must look at the processes of Islamization, colonialism, as well as decolonization or independence, if you like. And now what I would argue is kind of a modernization process. So if we go back to the Arab expansion and the Islamization of the northern eastern coast of Mozambique, that resulted in kind of very particular political and social, as well as cultural and religious institutions put in place in that area. But these institutions the Portuguese colonialism tried to enforce Christianity over those institutions, over that population, which had many years of Islamic tradition. And after independence, the ruling party, the Frelimo Marxist and kind of atheist state party, also collided with the same centuries of old institutions on this territory. And French historian Éric Morier-Genoux actually says that the Muslims of Mozambique, despite being numerically relevant, they were marginalized and they were fought against by colonial power and censored and repressed over time. So you have this kind of Western Christian and then atheist as well as Marxist values that were kind of enforced on this local population. And many scholars argue that this may have deeply affected the sense of dignity of the local population, but also created substantial resentment towards what we could call Western-inspired values, state institutions, Christianity, education. So you're starting to see here the same kind of rhetorics that a lot of Islamist insurgents often use, right, against Western education and institutions. So I would say that what instigated this particular conflict is basically a combination of historical factors, together with an aggressive penetration of external and local forces, very much linked to kind of this notion of global capitalism, as Cabo Delgado is actually a very rich region. They've found natural gas, one of the biggest discoveries, actually. But that has not led to the development of the region or of the people. So there are these grievances that are very much rooted in kind of a historical context that have come to the fore. And so if we want to look at the Islamic kind of aspect of it, Ansar al-Sunnah's violent activities in the gas-rich province started really by targeting local police stations and villages around 2017. But by May 2018, these attacks had reached horrendous proportions. We've started to see videos showing beheaded bodies on social media, decapitated victims from particular villages, in particular Palma, as you mentioned, Suzanne. However, it originally began to preach kind of a radical form of Islam and to build their own mosques. The local youth were beginning to be recruited, and they began to oppose the more traditional forms of Islam that already existed, literally rejecting individual liberties, refusing to send their children to school. And so this kind of internal dynamics began to arise.
Thank you, Nanka. That was incredibly clear and very helpful. What you described there, as you said, was almost the really familiar pattern of historical grievance, identity, resurgence of identity as defining a traditional Islamic, the sort of overlap between traditional Islamic culture and your own identity and your resistance to some kind of imposition of culture from outside. So that's all very familiar. The violence also, sadly, is also very familiar. I suppose the question I've got is the extent to which that focus on Islamic heritage is shared across the Muslim population of Mozambique, or whether the sort of violent group is just a tiny bit of it. So is it within a population, or does it actually have support amongst a much broader section of the population?
Yes, I mean, I think what is happening is twofold. There is these internal contradictions and relationships within the region itself, but you also then have the government and the capital, the Maputo, and the elite, the political elite there, that have their own agenda on how they want this conflict to be perceived, even in terms of how, the kind of interventions that they want to happen. So there's these two conflicting approaches to how we see what's going on. But there was a recent study actually by the Institute of Security Studies that have managed to actually conduct field work, which has been very difficult for experts to even have access to the region. And they say that according to Islamic leaders in the area, locally known as sheikhs, who were interviewed for the study, the first signs of extremism came to light actually in 2014, 2015 in the region, when young people from the local mosques began to rebel against kind of this established mosques that they had, and they began to practice what they call strange beliefs and practices. So there's also indication that some of this came from regional countries, so Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, as well as the Congo DRC. So the insurgents spoke kind of local languages such as Kiswahili and Arabic. So they profess a brand of Islam which is both rejected and denounced by Islamic authorities in the region. So there's already this internal kind of contradiction there. But the attacks in Cabo Delgado began, as we've mentioned already, in 2017. So the group has been developing on the kind of an unconcerned eye of the local and central government. And they've had at least 2 years, if we believe the reports, of social and psychological work to recruit, indoctrinate, and transform a lot of the youth who have these grievances. I mean, Cabo Delgado is one of the most underdeveloped regions of Mozambique, despite being the richest. So this is one of the key factors there.
So I'm thinking about that timeline, and those of us who've been following the Islamic State, the development of the caliphate, of course, that that matches exactly onto the sort of announcement of the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, and then the pattern that we saw actually across Europe, where you had this sort of huge uptick in people who wanted to do something. And in the case of Europe, so if you could travel, you went, and if you couldn't, you did something locally. And it looks like quite a coincidence that you also have this uptick of a new kind of radicalized youth in Mozambique at the same time. You mentioned how difficult it is to really know what's going on, because it's just very hard to get there. And I think that's the case across a lot of East Africa, and it's been the case for many years in Somalia as well. But there is a sort of a link of some kind, I think, between Somalia and Kenya and Tanzania and Mozambique. And the question that I think a lot of people are grappling with without really knowing the answer is the extent to which that link is there at all, or is there but in a not organized way, or is actually something that is organized, so that there is support and direction coming down to violent extremists in Mozambique from Somalia or Kenya. What do you think about that? I know it's very difficult really to know.
Yes, I think it's very difficult to know for sure. But from what the research that I've done, and I've seen other experts that are working in the region, is that there has been, especially with Tanzania, there has been reports in the media and even from the Tanzanian government of several arrests, actually very close to the border, of insurgents that have been linked to what is happening in Mozambique. I think the problem with governments in East Africa trying to state whether or not there is a link very much always stems from the reaction that they want to hear from the international community, or even in the kind of intervention that they want. They also, not all governments want to address the issue. They don't want to say that they do have this terrorist problem. But local civil society groups in Mozambique have actually claimed that, yes, there is contact with ISIS, but command and control remains local. The grievances remain important as to why insurgents are being recruited. So they have stressed that the role that government and business have to play in the conflict is actually significant. And these are claims that are I'm not sure, they're not verified. It's a claim by civil society groups, is that the Mozambican government, if it begins to actually address and to admit that the issue stems from some kind of these economic grievances, it would then not have the support from the international community and the regional bodies such as SADC and from South Africa, for example, because that is what it wants. It wants a military solution which is aggressive and which will not lead to kind of a diplomatic understanding between the different factions. And this is what we've seen in Nigeria. If I take us to West Africa very briefly, it's the same kind of mistakes.
So I do want you to take us to West Africa now. I think it's time for us to pivot over, but just to focus on what you were saying about the local civil society groups. I think that's very interesting because, of course, you can look at these conflicts on a sort of macro scale and say, Islamic State is spreading across Africa. It's claimed that the Mozambique attacks are happening in the name of the Central Africa province. You've got the West Africa province. So if you're Islamic State and you're drawing a map of Africa, you have portioned it into provinces which you're administering now. But as you said, that on the ground, these are local conflicts within societies and exploiting religious divisions sometimes within countries. So could you say a little bit more about what local civil society groups recommend in terms of those areas where there is essentially a religious clash, which is all embroiled in this whole question of politics and governance?
What they're saying is actually that let's not just focus on that particular aspect. I know that there's a lot of debate, especially in academic circles, on whether economic grievances do lead to conflict or not. But they are really insisting on this aspect, that is actually one of the key issues at stake in the region. Again, I can't state enough how underdeveloped the region is, and you have these massive oil and gas companies, which I will not name any particular ones, but they are massive and they attract a lot of investment, but that does not translate to the local population. And that has been, and if we want to tap into the kind of long-term historical and religious contradictions that are already existing in the region, these are just used at the end of the day to fuel even more and to make sure that you are able to recruit. And of course, this is also part of what some have called kind of a global movement, a jihadi global movement, where it's the moment where every conflict has been, ISIS has been able to use that and to claim some of those conflicts.
So thank you. So moving, as you say, zooming out, let's move to Northwest Africa here. Again, I mean, the difficulties preceded the Islamic State, but we now have the Islamic State in the mix as well. UN peacekeeping missions have been active for a long time. So the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, it's a bit of a mouthful, MINUSMA, was created in 2013, and there have been so far 241 MINUSMA fatalities, which is an extraordinary number. I mean, that's I think one of the highest, if not the highest, number of fatalities in a UN peacekeeping mission anywhere in the world. So it's astonishing we don't talk about it more, frankly, not least because one of the highest troop contributors is Bangladesh. So, there's hats off to them for keeping going with this. Most recently, over this Christmas, British troop deployment were also deployed to join the operation. So, where to start? Where should we start?
Yeah, I mean, much of the coverage of a lot of these conflicts on the continent. I mean, the ongoing instability, both in Mozambique, but also in the Sahel, in West Africa, as well as Central Africa. So it's a bit all over the continent, as you mentioned. A lot of the focus, I would argue, has been a little bit superficial at times, and because it is focusing on the single issue of whether external actors should intervene militarily or not, and if not, or if they do, which of the numerous candidates should do so. There are so many different external international organizations that want to put their hands at it, but we really have to, I think, interrogate to what extent these peacekeeping missions are able to truly have an impact. There is often a rush to respond, rightfully so, but without truly looking at what kind of response is justified or is needed from. And it's always turning to the international community, but they're also looking within Africa itself, within its regional bodies such as ECOWAS or SADC in the southern region. And it is often the case that a military solution is not the way forward. And we seem to forget of all the different conflicts over the years in Africa where this has happened already, and we're doing the same mistakes again. So we need to also ask, peacekeeping missions are inherently about stopping a conflict, but they also are often packaged with a more extensive kind of state building and processes. But what are we rebuilding in the first instance? Who are we involving in such processes? So even if we, just returning to Mozambique very briefly, the rush for military support has caused enormous debate. Civil society groups, as I said, have urged leaders to consider the lessons actually learned from places such as Somalia or even the Niger Delta. And any kind of intervention in the region, be it in Mozambique or in the Sahel, should also provide an avenue to pursue kind of political and diplomatic solutions. And this often means that you really need to understand the root causes of the conflict. I know this may sound pedantic and very academic, and it's not often what peacekeepers want to hear, but a former peacekeeping operation, UN mission in Guinea-Bissau, a small country in West Africa, has said once, you need to really penetrate with, as in be within society and understanding what are their condition, what do they actually need in order for you to be able to address the conflict.
That's a powerful argument. It makes it really hard, though, because I'm just Al-Naba, the Islamic State's magazine, recently stated that there are fierce ongoing battles against the armies of disbelief in Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, and their apostate militias. You could actually widen that as well and include Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso. So these are both old fault lines and new ones, aren't they? I think. And if we're talking about dealing with it through a series of local dialogues, what are the models? I mean, this has been going on, particularly in Nigeria, for a very long time with Boko Haram. And it seems like not really any progress has been made at all.
No, indeed. I mean, some people call them the G5 of the Sahel. If we look at what is going on both in Mali, it's a kind of a myriad of issues, both from a terrorist kind of point of view, but also from a national kind of infighting within the military. It's also been faced with huge climate change issues. So it's a very difficult situation. In Nigeria, you have the Boko Haram movement, which has been infamous for kidnapping hundreds of schoolgirls at Chibok. This was in 2014, and it has been carrying out major attacks, declaring a jihad actually in 2010. So the kind of, you have Burkina Faso, you have Chad, you have Mauritania, as you mentioned, Suzanne, and they are facing coup after coups, as well as being a kind of what is now called the hotbed of jihadi. If you think about what you mentioned about Al-Naba in its recent comment, is that if we look at the crisis in the Sahel, it is not just now a government versus insurgents. There is also a rivalry, according to some experts, between supporters of Al Qaeda and supporters of ISIS. So this rivalry is becoming so intense that some experts predict that Africa is going to be the battleground of jihad for the next 20 years, and it may replace the Middle East. That's a strong statement. Whether this is true or not, of course, only time will tell. But if we look at how Al Qaeda and ISIS share this kind of common loathing for secular Western supported rulers who they call apostates, but they also have major differences in their approach. So ISIS seems to go for extreme graphic violence, as demonstrated by the gruesome beheading videos across the Sahel and in Mozambique, whilst Al Qaeda and its affiliates has tried to win over the loyalty of local populations who tend to not have enough confidence in their governments, in their police. And so it exploits these kind of regional and ethnic grievances. So it is indeed becoming a hugely complex situation that needs a lot more than just very strong military forces.
Yes, and indeed, I remember during the sort of really intense days of the Libyan civil war, not that it's over, but there was a very intense period, it became very confusing, actually, who was a member of which extremist group, because essentially people were shifting and choosing according to local dynamics. And those roots, again, there's something really fascinating for people who don't understand Africa about the old trade routes across the Sahara Desert, which have been enabling for centuries movement of people, which are smuggling routes now for, again, movement of people, movement illicit groups, movement of arms, and cigarettes, drugs, whatever, and terrorist movements. And the question about who controls those routes and the fluidity of your membership of different groups is one that's impossible to understand as an outsider, and one of the reasons, I presume, why French forces have been there now since 2013 in the Sahel, and I don't feel that they're making the progress necessarily that they would want to make, unless you say differently.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think France, obviously, for those who don't know, is the former colonial power of a lot of the G5 Sahel countries. So it has those vested interest in maintaining kind of order and also bringing peace as much as it can. But again, and I think it is not making as much progress as we would like. But I would argue that it has taken a different approach. It has really tried to involve the five countries a lot more in providing training, in providing arms, in order to be able to also give them some kind of autonomy, but also as they would know best as well, in how to address what is going on in the region. It is not. It won't be easy to know for sure. Who controls the regions. Where are those lines drawn, as they may not be clear cut. And as you said, Suzanne, people may pick and choose depending on their grievances, depending on where they sit.
One of the phrases that we use in the West to describe places where we don't really know what's going on is ungoverned space. And you can make an argument that the Sahel is and always will be ungoverned space. It's not as easy to make that argument when you're talking about a country like Nigeria, which is in many senses one of the most sort of like advanced and dynamic countries in Africa, but has this sort of serious fault line between essentially, and we don't want to focus on religion, but between Christian parts and Islamic parts. To what extent does it feel like it's struggling, or is there a good news story, or how should we view what's happening there?
No, I unfortunately I wouldn't say that we have good news in Nigeria. It is indeed one of the countries in West Africa that I would argue is on the stronger side in terms of it being able to control its borders. It has a functioning democratic government, but it also faces significant kind of internal issues. There is this divide between the Christian and the Muslim side. And again, um, it is very much linked to the Islamic side being poorer. It has always been. This is an historical kind of an historical context. So this has always been the case. And again, these are grievances that are used. And I think in Nigeria, the Boko Haram situation has actually escalated probably beyond what the government at the time thought it could. I think they were caught by surprise by the extent to which it got out of control. I think it began again similar to what is happening in Mozambique. Some connections there. Something that could have been resolved relatively easily by really addressing the situation faced by its population. It is a failure of government, I would say. It's a failure of leadership, and it's something that is happening across the continent, unfortunately.
And is that, we're going to wrap up soon, but is that failure of leadership that you're talking about, is that feeding into a political dynamic where the people in the Christian part of the country is saying, we need to do something about this? In a positive or no, but actually in a positive, I'm thinking, are they saying, we recognize that there is a problem here and that just having a set of military engagements is not the answer, so maybe we need to do something differently politically? Is that happening?
No, I'd say it isn't happening, and it's a great question because it loops us back to what I did for my PhD thesis, which was looking a kind of what I call a leadership process. So trying to understand leadership not just from looking at those that are leading, but looking at that kind of interaction between those leading, but also those that are following, if you like, the leadership process. And that is the problem. I think that the political elite, but also just the what I could call the bourgeoisie or the elite in both Mozambique, we can talk about Mozambique and Nigeria simultaneously, is that unfortunately until the elite is not affected by what is going on, they will remain quite far from it, and they will want to keep the status quo, which at the end of the day will benefit their own interests. And I think that is very much the key as to which this failure of leadership and governance always comes back to what I argue is a kind of a lack of mutual understanding. If those that are leading are not able to understand, even at the basic level, what both in Cabo Delgado or in the northern parts of Nigeria, what are the people really going through? Those are the people you're supposed to lead over. You're supposed to provide basic goods and services. If you're not able to understand what they are going through, you will not be able to kind of resolve the ongoing grievances and kind of the resulting violence that will emerge.
So if I understand you correctly, I think what you're saying, which is a typical problem, is that essentially when you have a violent resistance, the natural thing for the leading party to do is to look for a security solution, and either on purpose or actually just by accident because of the course of events, that then ends up playing up the divisions among the local population, because they see essentially a violent Islamist adversary who is kidnapping children and beheading children, and therefore it naturally chooses to support a government whose policy is a military one or a repressive one. Is that kind of, I mean, that seems to be what has evolved in both situations.
Yes, I mean, I think so. What I'm trying to say is that it is something that, in particular, during my time at King's College London at the African Leadership Center, a lot of the research we did there was to try and understand, obviously, the root causes of conflict and why it emerges. Is why would young people want to commit such atrocities? For example, you must be completely desperate. You must have absolutely nothing to lose in order to join such movements. So it's really about, if there is a lack of leadership, if you are facing these grievances over many, many years, over many generations, who do you turn to? So it's about kind of finding that relationship with someone else, which is not the state. So if you have this lack of leadership, this failure in governance, in being able to even provide the basic schools and education and health services, you turn to the nearest, who's going to provide that for you. And I've seen that across other countries in West Africa, where with a lack of education due to strikes and governments not paying salaries, people actually turning to Islamic schools. So it's a void, it's a leadership void that is filled by other groups, and often violent ones, that are able to tap into this kind of grievance.
Dr. Nayanka Perdigao, that was a tour de force. Thank you so much for spending your time talking to me today. And you've set a challenge for the leaders of quite a lot of African countries. And I hope they rise to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. You can find the Centre for Geopolitics on Twitter at @CamGeopolitics, and all our events are advertised online on our website at cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk.